on this edition of It's a Miracle. It started out as a scuba dive in paradise, but soon turned into a frightening encounter with death. When these two scuba divers become trapped in an underwater cave, one must make the decision of his life.
The number one first priority to a Navy diver is never leave your buddy.
There's only one way out, and only one thing between him and his next breath of air.
He was 8 to 9 feet long, the biggest moray eel I've ever seen.
And they were out for a relaxing and fun day of hiking. But suddenly and without warning, they found themselves in a frantic struggle for survival. Every mother's nightmare becomes reality when her daughter has a severe asthma attack and runs out of medicine. Stranded on the sheer face of a mountain and facing a freak snowstorm, this is a time for heroes.
I was paralyzed by fear. The worst case scenario would be that she'd go into severe respiratory arrest and die.
Along the whole way, she kept asking me, is my daughter gonna live?
Then, they say curiosity killed the cat, but not this tabby. A lethal gas leak threatens to destroy an entire neighborhood until a household cat intervenes and a potential catastrophe is averted.
I believe there was a miracle here.
6 to 8 homes would have blown up simultaneously.
Then, the search for a young boy's origins becomes a race against time as a couple's adopted son awaits desperately needed treatment for a rare form of cancer. Only a miracle can save Brian Bauman's life.
That was the start of something unbelievable.
These stories and more on It's a Miracle.
Hello and welcome to It's a Miracle. I'm Richard Thomas.
And I'm Nia Peoples. Tonight you're going to discover that miracles can happen anywhere and everywhere, from the top of a snow-covered mountain
To the bottom of the ocean. And that's where we're headed first, on a diving expedition off the island of Oahu, into deep waters and a dark cave filled with unexpected terror and an even more unexpected miracle. Rudy Smith and his friend Scott Schindler of Hawaii were both professional divers working at a U.S. Navy research laboratory. But their goal on this afternoon was strictly pleasure. They were on a lobster hunt, headed for an underwater cave where Rudy had never failed to find them by the dozen.
Just the two of us went out. We knew what we were going to do. It was short and sweet. We were going to anchor the boat, jump in the water, go down, grab some lobster, come right back out and head back.
Because of the short duration of the dive, they each wore partially filled tanks with a limited air supply.
The tanks had at least enough air to last 20 minutes at the depth we were working. We felt real safe in using those tanks because this is something we'd done before.
The divers paused every 10 or 15 feet to equalize, a process that helped them adapt to the depths. If they stayed down too long, they would have to allow time for similar pauses on the way back up to avoid contracting the bends.
Whenever you dive deep, there's always a risk of the bends, absorbing too much nitrogen in the body. The most serious cases, the body basically explodes from the inside out. You cough up your lungs.
The entrance to the cave was very narrow, so one at a time, Rudy and Scott removed their tanks and pushed them down the narrow passageway ahead of them.
My tank in front of me would catch on things. My shoulders would bump into the walls. It was just a tight experience, like being pinched for a little bit till you could wiggle through it.
The end of the passageway opened up into a cavern. The divers split up to sweep opposite sides of the lobster-filled cave. If nothing went wrong, Rudy and Scott would have 10 minutes to choose their lobsters and return to the surface.
I always weigh the benefit against the risk, the perceived benefit of having a bunch of lobster on the grill was much greater than the chance of getting caught in the cave and trapped. So it was a risk I was willing to take.
5 minutes into his search, Rudy heard something he will never forget.
I probably picked up 2 or 3 lobster and put them in my bag when I heard a very distinct voice, and it said 2 words, "Get out."
Rudy looked to his friend to see if he had called out, but Scott was busy collecting lobsters.
I had no idea where the words came from, let alone where a voice would come from, and I just disregarded it.
An alarm squeal from his regulator prompted Rudy to look at his watch. He had been in the water for 15 minutes. He still had a minute or two before he and Scott would have to leave.
I started to go back collecting lobster, and as soon as I started back, the voice resonated again. It said, "Get out now." Just as clear as if a person were a few feet away from you, speaking very directly, demanding you do something right now.
Before Rudy had a chance to respond, he spotted a figure advancing towards him out of the darkness.
The biggest moray eel I've ever seen. He was 8 to 9 feet long, and his girth was the size of my thigh. That's a very frightening experience, to have 8-9 foot of eel moving directly at your chest.
The eel latched onto Rudy's lobster bag, and the ensuing struggle began to churn up silt from the ocean floor.
The cave became one big, large cloud of dust. You could not see past your face mask.
Rudy let the eel wrestle the lobster bag away from him, but now he faced a more deadly situation. His air supply was almost gone.
The amazing conclusion when It's a Miracle continues. Professional divers Rudy Smith and Scott Schindler are hunting for lobsters off the coast of Oahu. After entering an underwater cave, a mysterious voice urges them to leave. Disregarding the warning, they're confronted by a huge moray eel. The ensuing struggle leaves them trapped in the cave with zero visibility and running out of air.
I didn't know where I was. I didn't know up from down, left from right. I couldn't see my partner. I couldn't see with my light. It would give me no sense of direction. All I could see was the cloud of particles suspended in front of my mask. I started to panic. I didn't know if the eel was going to attack me, bite me. I couldn't find my way out. I started bouncing off the walls looking for the opening to the cave.
He became more desperate with every passing moment. The situation looked hopeless.
I actually thought that there was no way I was getting out of that cave. My worst nightmare, which would have been to be trapped in a cave without air, had come true. I knew I was going to die. I knew suffocation was not a pleasant way to die, and here I was in a cave getting ready to suffocate.
As Rudy inhaled the last fumes of oxygen from his scuba tank, he gave up hope of surviving. At that very moment, he felt something take hold of his body.
Someone grabbed me from behind and began guiding my body, and that feeling was a feeling of safety, a feeling of being embraced and held and being okay, and I just totally relaxed and went limp, and that someone took me out of the cave.
Suddenly, Rudy found himself in clear water outside the cave entrance with his scuba tank on his back. Scott was nowhere in sight.
I don't know how I got out of that cave with my equipment on. I don't know.
He tried re-entering the cave to rescue Scott, but couldn't fit through the narrow opening with his tank on. His air gauge showed he had no air left. Reluctantly, he returned to the surface for more air.
That was the most gut-wrenching decision I've ever made in my life. The number one first priority to a Navy diver is never leave your buddy.
Rudy ascended, not having time to decompress along the way. He hurriedly changed his air tank and grabbed a spare tank of air for his friend. but Scott surfaced before he could get back into the water.
He spit his regulator out, he gasped for a breath of air, and just hung on the side of the boat for a little bit. He looked like he was already dead. In fact, I thought he might have gotten the bends and been sick.
Once Scott recovered enough to talk, they marveled over the fact that they both had risen to the surface without pausing to decompress.
We should have been perhaps paralyzed, or worse, brain dead. And yet we were alive without any symptoms.
But that was just one remarkable event among many. Who had voiced the two warnings that Rudy heard? What mysterious force had pulled Rudy from the cave? And how had he made it out through that narrow entrance wearing a scuba tank? It turned out that Scott had a similar experience leaving the cave.
When Scott got in the boat, he asked me how I had gotten him out of the cave. I told Scott that I hadn't got him out of the cave, that I thought he had gotten me out of the cave.
The same mysterious force had pulled them both from the cave and had enabled them to return to the surface unharmed.
It's my belief that God moved in and interceded in my behalf, saved me for a purpose that I've yet to discover.
It was an experience that would transform Rudy's life.
It was a divine moment. It was being given a second chance. It was something that touched my life and has continued to touch my life ever since it happened. So, to me, it's a miracle.
We'll be right back with more stories that defy belief when It's a Miracle continues.
Coming up next, see a couple who were supposed to be resting quietly at home, recuperating from surgery. They were supposed to be getting better, but they were both feeling worse.
It was incredible. We would get up, eat, and go back to sleep.
Their lives and the lives of their neighbors were in grave peril. Discover who solved this mysterious dilemma. And later, his entire life, Brian Bauman just wanted to be a pilot. He was about to graduate at the top of his class at the Air Force Academy when he and his family got the news. He was going to die very soon. Witness the miracle of an entire nation. These stories and more when It's a Miracle continues.
It's a miracle.
Someone once said that curiosity killed the cat. Well, whoever said it never met Ringo, a red tabby. Ringo's curiosity not only saved its life, but the lives of many others.
In the summer of 1995, the Bowling Green, Ohio home of Ray and Carol Steiner was a hospital ward. Ray spent his days on the couch, recuperating from a triple bypass operation, and his wife Carol was confined to a hospital bed, recovering from foot surgery. Both of them were sleeping nearly 19 hours a day.
It was incredible. We would get up, eat, and go back to sleep. And then we would get hungry again, eat, and go back to sleep.
That summer was extremely hot, and we'd had the house locked up with the air conditioning on. And we both were very tired, had headaches, high blood pressure, loss of memory, and neither of us could figure out why.
The doctor kept saying it was post-operative fatigue.
The Steiners' constant companion through all of this was a red tabby cat that Carol had rescued as a kitten.
I saw someone getting rid of a bunch of kittens and a mother cat, and it was obvious they were going to be thrown in a field. So I just reached in, grabbed a piece of red fluff, and I brought it home.
The kitten never meowed. When he wanted to enter or leave the house, he would drum on the door with his paws. And so they named him Ringo. And then one morning, as Ray was napping and Carol was reading a book, she heard a loud knock on the front door.
What?
But when she went to answer it, she found Ringo sitting there. Apparently, he had thrown himself against the door.
And so I thought, geez, he must really want to go outside.
You want to go outside?
I opened the door and he wouldn't go out. He just stood there in the foyer. I had the door open. I said, Kitty, let's go out. And he looked up at me. It was very, very frustrating.
Ringo had never acted like this before, but Carol was too tired to wait for him to make up his mind, and so she went back to bed.
And I got my leg up, just got relaxed just for a minute. Wham! He threw himself at the door again.
The cat was beginning to try her patience, but it was obvious that he wanted something, and so she struggled back to the front door. But once again, Ringo wouldn't move.
I've never seen you act like this before.
I tried to push him out with my crutch, and I was really kind of giving him a good oomph as much as I could, and he just got really stubborn about the whole thing. He just stood there. And I says, well, come back in or go out. And he just stood there. That was it. I opened the door a little further, and when he saw me give a movement like I might come out, he stepped onto the porch. And then he turned over his shoulder, and he kept giving me a high meow.
This was the first time Carol had ever heard Ringo make a sound, but when she approached him to find out what he wanted, he moved away.
Where are you going?
It was as if he was trying to get her to follow him, and so she did.
And he would go just a few feet and wait for old Clunky to catch up to him. And then he'd look over his shoulder again, make sure I was there. And I says, okay, I'm coming, I'm coming. And so he just carefully led me all the way around to the right side of our house. And I thought, boy, I wonder what he's doing on this side of the house. This is unusual.
At first, Carol thought Ringo was leading her to a dead bird, but then he stopped and began pawing at the ground like a dog.
He starts digging in our lava landscaping, and he was actually getting bloody feet over it, trying to dig down into the landscaping.
Realizing that Ringo was desperately trying to show her something, Carol moved toward the place he was digging, and that's when it hit her.
That's gas.
It was almost as pungent as if you would turn on a gas stove and wait for about, 15, 20 seconds. It was really that strong. All of a sudden, I was awake. I didn't hurt. I had an adrenaline rush.
Ray?
And so the first thing I was yelling was, Ray, we have a gas leak.
They immediately called the gas company, and a serviceman was sent to the home.
And he says, oh, don't worry, Mrs. Steiner. I'm sure it's absolutely nothing.
He tested the gas meter for leaks, but no bubbles appeared, which meant that the system was safe.
I don't see anything here.
And he turns around, he says, Mrs. Steiner, look, the gas meter's perfect. There's no gas leak.
Carol wasn't reassured. She directed him to test the area where Ringo had been digging.
Right here.
And so he just basically was like, let's humor the lady. And he took his handheld meter and he just extended it out, and it immediately registered right to the top of that meter.
Whoa.
I think he was totally surprised, totally astonished, and he certainly became quite pale. And his reaction to the whole thing was like, oh my God, we really have a bad gas leak, and I've got to get to the truck.
Don't worry about it. Yeah, we're fine. We're just got to get out of here right now.
It turned out the leak was so large that the slightest exposure to a spark would have caused a disaster.
Are they coming? Yeah, they are, Mr. Steiner.
If the gas had ignited, our house would have gone first, quickly followed by all the homes that would have been linked with us. And so 6 to 8 homes would have blown up simultaneously.
Ringo saved more than 20 lives from going up in a ball of flame.
It's gas.
It turned out that methane had been leaking from a crack in the gas main and accumulating in the Steiners' house, which had been shut tight against the heat. The Steiners, suffering all the symptoms of methane poisoning, were on the verge of dying from it. Eventually, Ringo received national recognition for his life-saving efforts.
Ringo was given the Stillman Award from the American Humane Association because they felt that he interceded with bravery and saved our lives and many other lives.
I believe there was a miracle here. Cats, as has been said many times, aren't known to do such things, and him saving our lives is indeed a miracle.
I do believe that there are angels around, and I think they use whatever method that they have to take care of people. And I believe a guardian angel did step in. And the method that the guardian angel used was Ringo. He saved our lives, there's just no question about it.
His kitty saved the day.
We'll be right back.
It's a miracle.
Our next story begins and ends halfway around the world, in Korea. And in between, you'll meet a remarkable family who suffered through an incredible ordeal. Their story is one which will touch your heart and prove that miracles have no geographical boundaries. In 1977, Elaine and Stephen Bauman fulfilled a lifelong dream when they adopted a 3-year-old Korean boy who they named Brian, and who instantly became a part of their family.
The night we received him from Korea, no one wanted to sleep in their own rooms. Everybody wanted to sleep around Brian. We just didn't want to miss any moment enjoying him.
As Brian grew, he became a very serious, goal-oriented young man.
When he was 9 years old, he informed us he was going to be an aeronautical engineer. That was his words. Not I'm going to build airplanes. It was I'm going to be an aeronautical engineer.
And then at 12, Brian made another major announcement.
I had a great interest in aircraft and flying, and I wanted to serve my country later down the road, and the best way for me to accomplish that is probably go to the Air Force Academy.
And 7 years later, he was there, a member of one of the most elite flying squads in the world. And then, during his senior year, while working toward his pilot's license, all his hopes and dreams were destroyed.
And I was studying, and I just had a hard time concentrating. And at the same time, I started feeling ill. It felt like some kind of stomach virus.
Brian kept hoping the pain would go away, but it only got worse.
I started becoming a little bit more suspicious. Like, okay, it's not just a stomach virus. There's got to be something going on.
Hey, Brian.
And so, finally, he paid a visit to the base doctor, Major Bill Gibson.
Thought it was just acute gastroenteritis. And what happened was Brian continued to have abdominal pain and kept coming back and had weight loss and fevers.
Tell me something. This is a little more tender?
Yeah.
Right
All
here.
the symptoms pointed toward appendicitis. And so, in October 1995, Brian had his appendix removed. But what the doctor found was not what he expected. Brian's appendix was a completely healthy organ. And so the mystery continued. And then a series of tests and blood work finally revealed the true cause of his pain. Brian had a rare form of leukemia.
Just sit down here so we can have a little talk.
I'm now breaking news to him that he has a disease which is potentially very fatal.
You have a form of cancer. It's quite serious, and it can be very dangerous.
His dreams of being an Air Force pilot and holding these degrees and doing all these other things have just been radically altered.
Brian contacted his parents and gave them the bad news.
Hello.
He was shook. His voice was trembling.
Is there some other test to make sure?
Never heard that from him ever before. My mind was racing. The words leukemia just rolling over and over again in my head. Kind of saw some dreams of not only Brian's but ours starting to vanish.
The Baumans left immediately for the Air Force Academy to be with their son.
Brian? It's Mom.
Brian, how are you doing?
He doesn't look good.
Brian was sleeping, maybe 18 to 20 hours a day and gotten very thin. It was really frightening for me because he'd always been so full of energy. So this was really, it was hard to watch.
That afternoon, the Baumans met with Dr. Gibson at the cadet clinic.
So what can we do, Doctor?
Dr. Gibson told the Baumanns that the only hope for their son was a bone marrow transplant.
Biological match.
We knew the best chance for his success was a biological match, donor.
Sister, brother, with that, the family. Okay.
Absolutely.
But there was a major obstacle in the way.
We knew if we didn't find a donor within the first year, Brian would die. We also knew that we had absolutely no information of his Korean family.
And so the Baumanns began a desperate search. They started with the agency that had set up the adoption. And a representative was immediately sent to Korea to check records there.
When children are put up for adoption, that's not considered a good thing in Korea, and it's sort of a shame, and you don't want to be known to be involved with that.
We knew that the information that was in the files could be completely false. We knew that the mothers could give false names or no names.
What they did have was Brian's birth name, Kim Sung-dak. But while the Korean records were available, they proved to be a dead end, with no real leads to the mother's identity. Back in Minnesota, the news was a devastating blow for the Baumann family.
We know you've already started to work. We can see your work. We just want to thank you for what you've done already. Amen.
Amen. It'll be okay, Mom. It's going to be all fine.
We knew that we had to do something. We had to stay active in this thing.
Steve Baumann for Linda Oransky.
And so, with time running out,
right.
Mr. Baumann tried to locate a racially compatible donor in Korea, but the odds were overwhelming.
From what we understood, there was like 1,700 Koreans on the marrow donor program. Now, how does that compare? Well, the chances of matching is about 1 in 200,000. It was not good news.
With his condition deteriorating rapidly and little hope in finding a relative or donor, only a miracle could save Brian Baumann's life. The amazing conclusion, when it's a miracle, continues.
It's a miracle.
Sometimes when a person holds out their hand to another in a time of need, the gesture can be so profound that it seems miraculous. But when an entire nation becomes involved in the plight of a single individual, it's more than just miraculous. It's a testament to man's basic goodness and the amazing powers that we as human beings possess. And now, the conclusion to the remarkable story of Brian Sung-dak Baumann. From the time he was a young boy, Brian Baumann wanted to be a pilot. But in his senior year in the U.S. Air Force Academy, he was struck down with a rare form of leukemia. Brian's only hope, a biologically compatible bone marrow donor, preferably a relative. But Brian was a Korean orphan, adopted by Americans, and 18 years later there was no record of his biological family. The situation seemed hopeless. Now his family could only wait and pray that someone or something would save Brian's life.
Already started to work.
And then a Korean newspaper published an article on the Baumann family's race to find a donor, and Brian's story soon spread throughout Korea. Brian Baumann had begun to capture the hearts of the Korean public, and telethons and television specials joined in the search to find a donor to save this courageous young man's life.
That was the start of something unbelievable.
There was a tremendous outpouring of concern, and suddenly thousands of Koreans were registering as potential donors, something that their tradition had always forbidden. But the odds of finding a match were 1 in 200,000. Back in the United States, while the Baumanns waited for news from Korea, Brian's condition took a turn for the worse.
The doctors thought Brian might be going through what was referred to as a blast crisis, a sudden acceleration of the leukemia.
But something was about to occur that would give the Bowmans a new sense of hope. A family in Korea recognized 3-year-old Brian from an old photograph.
여기는 제 동생이고요.
They remembered that he had a half-sister named Soon-mi.
동생이 같이 있었어요.
Now at last, the Bowmans may have found a biologically compatible donor. A few weeks later, the entire Bowman family was on hand to meet her as she arrived from Korea.
How do you greet a Korean? What the book said was, well, you bow, you don't show the top of your head, you don't shake their hands.
So nice of you to come.
Obviously, you don't hug or anything like that. Well, they came up the walkway and threw their arms around, just hugs and kisses. It was like, take that book and throw it away.
But their happiness was to be short-lived. The next day, bone marrow and blood tests came back negative.
I had to go and explain to Brian and his family and the sister that even though she had made this heroic trip over here, that she wasn't a match. All that work had been for nothing.
You could hear a pin drop. It was so quiet. Our hearts just absolutely sank.
Hello.
But Brian's
Yes, it is.
family refused to give up hope, and his father continued to tirelessly search for a donor.
Thank you.
And then the miracle they'd been praying for occurred. A donor had been found, a Korean army sergeant.
We had heard he was a pretty good match, so they were going to redo the testing. It turned out that he was a very good match.
Brian was rushed to the Seattle Veterans Hospital in Washington, where he underwent chemotherapy before the new bone marrow was transplanted into his body. Now there was nothing left to do but wait.
Oh, it was horrible. And knowing that you had no control, couldn't help him.
But the operation was successful, and Brian slowly gained back his strength and his life.
Oh, you're tough. You really are. Such a fighter, such a fighter.
And 1 year later, his lifelong dream came true.
I was able to finally graduate from Air Force Academy, and that was one of the happiest days of my life, to finish and complete getting that diploma.
A few months later, Brian returned to Korea for the first time in 21 years to meet the man who had saved his life.
I wanted to thank him on behalf of myself and my family. And there's nothing better that I could do, just say thanks for saving my life.
And so 2 men, an Air Force cadet and an Army soldier, strangers from halfway around the world, were able to share a moment of true brotherly love.
Reflecting back on having cancer, I feel like there's other people out there who will help their fellow man. They're out there and people care what's going on. I definitely feel like it was a miracle just because the odds were not in my favor to find a donor. The odds were not in my favor to recover as well as I did and be able to continue on with my life. My family members think it's a miracle. My friends think it's a miracle. I think my life has been charmed.
We'll be right back.
Coming up next on It's a Miracle. They were out for a relaxing and fun day of hiking, but suddenly and without warning, they found themselves in a frantic struggle for survival. Every mother's nightmare becomes reality when her daughter has a severe asthma attack and runs out of medicine. Stranded on the sheer face of a mountain and facing a freak snowstorm, this is a time for heroes.
I was paralyzed by fear. The worst case scenario would be that she'd go into severe respiratory arrest and die.
Along the whole way, she kept asking me, is my daughter gonna live?
That's next when It's a Miracle returns.
Be prepared. It's the motto of the Boy Scouts of America, and it's good advice for everyone. Our next story shows what can happen when you're not prepared, when you're left in a dangerous, life-threatening situation, and all you can do is hope and pray for a miracle.
Early in 1998, Mary Davenport and her daughter Miranda decided to take a day hike on Mount Lemmon, just outside of Tucson, Arizona.
And we were looking forward to just going out and stomping through the woods and having a great time together. The scenery is just fabulous. The mountains are so pretty.
Even though Miranda suffered from chronic asthma, she enjoyed physical activity and especially enjoyed spending time with her mother.
Got everything? Yep. We had just started hiking recently, and this was the highest elevation hike that we had taken thus far, but we had been out several weekends and just had a ball.
They chose the spectacular Butterfly Trail, which rose and fell from 6,000 to 8,000 feet above sea level.
We probably were in the trail maybe 3 or 4 miles. We hiked down into a deep gorge, and it was very pretty there. It was fun going down, but the climb up was very challenging.
How you feeling?
And we hadn't taken into consideration the impact of the elevation on Miranda's breathing.
Think you can make it? I hope so.
The air is thinner. It's harder to get the amount of oxygen into the lungs that one can at a lower elevation. Well, as we were coming up out of the gorge, she had to just stop and take a rest.
Oh, hold on, I need to take a break.
I could hear that she was beginning to develop a wheeze, and that's always the first sign that she's going into an acute attack.
Do you need your inhaler? I just want to get out of here.
3.5 hours into the wilderness hike, Miranda's asthma completely overwhelmed her. They were miles from help, and Miranda couldn't go on.
You okay?
It got very bad. I was helping her up one climb, and she simply collapsed.
Whoa, you okay?
She took out Miranda's inhaler.
Here.
But it was nearly empty, with only a couple of doses left. And these had no effect on her escalating condition.
Take another one.
I was very, very scared. I remembered that we had the cell phone with us.
The phone.
It didn't occur to me at first. I was in such a state of panic.
911.
I made contact with 911, and the line got very staticky.
I can't hear you.
And then the battery just died.
It's dead.
I didn't know what to do.
As Miranda's asthma attack got worse, a storm front approached.
The temperature began to drop, and it clouded over, and the wind picked up, and eventually it began to snow, and we weren't prepared for that.
Suddenly, they found themselves stranded on the sheer face of a mountain.
I felt paralyzed. I was paralyzed by fear. The worst case scenario would be that she'd go into severe respiratory arrest and die. I was just getting more and more upset inside, and I turned to look down the trail to check on Miranda, and I saw a group of Boy Scouts walking up the trail.
Oh my God, I don't believe it. It's the Boy Scouts.
It was like manna from heaven. I couldn't believe it. I was so thrilled.
Miranda, the Boy Scouts are coming. I'll go down and get them. My daughter's having an asthma attack. She's up here, up this way.
The troop of scouts went into action immediately. Eagle Scout A.J. Myers could tell Miranda was in trouble.
Her skin was kind of pale. She's just kind of lying there, gasping for air.
Scoutmaster John Lastovica directed the boys to wrap Miranda in a blanket.
She couldn't talk. She could barely communicate with facial expressions, hand expressions. She was in shock.
I have an inhaler.
Miraculously, his son Ian suffered from the same condition.
I, too, have asthma, so I gave her my inhaler because she uses the same thing.
But by now, Miranda's condition had deteriorated to the point that the inhalant was useless. Luckily, Mary's first call had gone through, and a helicopter had been dispatched, but it was searching in the wrong area.
They didn't know exactly where we were, so with the Boy Scouts' help, rescue was able to pinpoint where we were.
Using a map and compass and a large antenna on top of Mount Bigelow and the cell phone that we had, there was a communications link established between the troop and the chopper pilot.
It's 350 bearing.
We were able to give them a compass bearing from the antenna in an approximate distance.
The rescue helicopter had found them, but they were not out of the woods yet. The forest was too dense for it to land. Miranda would have to be moved to a clearing about 1 mile farther up the trail.
We're going to have to get her out of here.
The Boy Scouts would use their ingenuity and training to fashion a makeshift stretcher.
We found big logs, probably about a couple inches in diameter, about 6 to 12 feet long. We stuck the poles into the sleeping bag. We put her on there and we carried her until we could find an open area.
We'll get you up there, don't worry.
It was very, very slow going. And the whole time, Miranda was having a very hard time breathing. Her color was beginning to change. She was beginning to go a little blue around the lips.
Along the whole way, she kept asking me, is my daughter gonna live? Is she gonna be okay? The only thing we could say is yes to keep her calm.
Hey, look!
Following directions from the Scouts, a larger rescue team arrives. They are able at last to move Miranda the remaining distance to the staging area for the airlift.
They finally got her to the area, and at that point, they dropped a line from the helicopter, and they hooked it up to the metal basket that was part of the gurney, strapped her down, and they simply lifted her off the mountain. When I saw her being lifted, it was probably one of the most frightening moments of my life. To watch my daughter being carried away, dangled from a line 70 feet below a helicopter.
I'm very grateful to the Boy Scouts. I think that they did save my life. They were wonderful in every aspect of the situation. It's great that they were there. In addition to their help, their physical help, they brought a lot of good humor to the situation, so they were able to take some of the scariness out of it.
If the Scouts had not come along when they did, I think it's very possible that Miranda would have died that night. We wouldn't have been able to leave the mountain, and the temperature was dropping.
Since 1910, in all the handbooks of the Boy Scout of America, the motto has been, be prepared, and the slogan has been, do a good turn daily. And I'm really proud of the boys of 172 who put the slogan and motto into action.
What if we take a bearing off those TV towers up there?
There's no greater feeling than finding someone, helping them, and knowing that they're gonna live. There's no greater feeling than that.
I think that I'm more confident in myself, knowing that I can and have saved someone's life.
They were like angels, and I'll never forget them for the rest of my life. They'll always hold a very special place in my heart. I think the biggest miracle was that so many people came together to help Miranda that we didn't know, and they all appeared exactly when we needed them to be there.
How you doing, Miranda? Stay with us for more It's a Miracle right after this.
That's our show for tonight. Thanks for joining us.
And we hope to see you next week for more amazing miracles.
Until then, I'm Richard Thomas.
And I'm Mia Peoples. Good night.